You know that feeling of walking a tightrope, but without a net? For a lot of people, that's what their emotional life feels like every single day. So today, we're going to get into the science behind that feeling. We're diving deep into the genetic threads that can contribute to what's known as borderline personality disorder, or BPD. And just to be clear right up front, this isn't about blame. It's about biology. So, to really understand what we're talking about, let's start with a story. We're going to step into the world of someone named Anna for a moment. Her experience really helps put a human face on all the clinical labels and gives us a sense of the emotional reality we're exploring here. This quote, man, it just captures the heart of the matter, doesn't it? I mean, just imagine living in that constant state of vulnerability, where any little gust of wind, a small disagreement, a text that gets left on read, could send you completely spiraling. It's this profound, constant feeling of instability. And on top of that, people like Anna get hit with these labels all the time. You know the ones. You're too sensitive. You're just too intense. It's all too much. But these words, they completely miss the point, right? They don't explain why a simple text can trigger hours of gut-wrenching anxiety, or why a casual comment from a friend can feel like total and complete abandonment. These feelings are absolutely real, they're overwhelming, and as we're about to see, they have a biological basis. So all of this lived experience, it naturally leads us to a really important question. And this is where we're going to shift our focus away from judgment, away from blame, and into a much more useful space: scientific investigation. But why? Why does this happen? Well, I can tell you what the answer isn't. It's not about having weak will or some kind of character flaw. Not at all. What the science is making more and more clear is that the story often starts way deeper, with our biology. It starts with the genetic hand we're dealt. All right, so let's follow those clues. To really get a handle on the biological side of things, we're going to look at what some huge studies, we're talking large-scale family and twin studies, have found about the genetic links to BPD. And trust me, the numbers they found are pretty revealing. 46%. What does that number mean? Well, a massive Swedish study that followed thousands and thousands of people, they landed right there. They found that about 46% of the risk for developing BPD comes from genetic factors. Now, that is a huge piece of the puzzle, right? It tells us genes are super important. But it also tells us they're not the whole story. And check this out. This chart really shows you how that risk breaks down in families. If you have a sibling with BPD, your own risk is nearly 5 times higher than average. That's pretty staggering. For a cousin, it's still higher than normal, but way less so. The pattern here is crystal clear. The closer you are genetically, the more of that vulnerability you share. Okay, so at this point, you're probably wondering, is there a single BPD gene that we can just point to? It's a great question, but the answer is no. Turns out the genetic story is way, way more complicated than that. And it's not for a lack of looking. Scientists have searched extensively, and they just haven't found a single gene that's responsible. Instead, what we see with BPD is something called a polygenic pattern. Okay, what does that mean? The best way to think about it is like a giant potluck dinner. It's not one big casserole that makes the meal, right? It's hundreds of small dishes that everybody brings. And in this case, each tiny genetic variation is like one of those small dishes. It just adds a little bit to the overall risk. And together, they help shape things like how we regulate our emotions and respond to stress. So let's move on, because this is where it all comes together. See, genes don't exist in a vacuum. This next part is all about where that biological blueprint meets the real world. And honestly, this might be the most important piece of the whole puzzle. The idea is called gene-environment interaction. And it sounds fancy, but it's actually a pretty simple and really profound concept. It's the idea that our genes and our life experiences are in this constant conversation, constantly working together to shape who we are and how we feel. Probably the best way to picture this whole thing is with an alarm system metaphor. Think about it like this. Your genes are like the internal wiring of a smoke alarm. They decide just how sensitive it is. But the environment, that's the room the alarm is in. So if you've got super sensitive wiring, but it's in a calm, clean, stable room, it might never, ever go off. But you take that exact same sensitive alarm and you put it in a smoky, chaotic room, it's going to be blaring all the time. And let's bring this right back to Anna's story. Remember her? Her family history was full of this kind of emotional static. Mood swings, sudden tempers, long, heavy silences. Nobody ever put a name to it, but she just felt it in the air. Now, this is really important. This doesn't mean her family caused her struggles. What it shows is how a genetically sensitive system can be profoundly shaped by an emotionally turbulent environment. Okay, so all this science and data, it all leads us to what is, honestly, a really hopeful and empowering place. Because biology is an explanation, not a verdict. It's not destiny. This really is the heart of it all. Having a genetic predisposition is not a life sentence, it's a sensitivity. You've probably heard the saying, genes load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. And that might sound grim, but it's actually incredibly hopeful, because it means the environment also holds the key to safety and to healing. So let's just wrap up the key points here to make sure it's all clear. First, we know genes account for about half the risk for BPD, and that risk goes up the more closely related you are. Second, it's not one single BPD gene we're looking for, it's a complex polygenic pattern. We also saw that those genetic roots overlap with other conditions like depression and bipolar disorder. And maybe the biggest takeaway of all, genes might load the gun, but it's the environment that pulls the trigger. That genetic sensitivity is just half the story. The other half is the world we live in, and that's what shapes the outcome. And that leaves us with one final big question to think about. If biology sets the sensitivity of that alarm system, then how can we build a kinder, safer world for the alarm? See, understanding all this biological wiring isn't the end of the conversation. It's just the beginning. It helps us shift from asking, "What's wrong with you?" to asking a much better question. How can we create a more supportive environment for this highly sensitive system to not just survive, but to thrive? And that, right there, is a question worth exploring.